All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us during the Lytham Partners Winter 2021 Investor Conference and what we're calling our 2022 Vision Event. My name is Robert Blum, Managing Partner of Lytham Partners, and during this fireside chat, we welcome Arianne, ticker symbol of DAN on the TSX Venture and DRRSF on the OTC, and their president, Mr. Brian Ostroff. We're going to dive into questions in just a moment, but I want to remind everyone that Brian is available for one-on-one meetings later this week. If you've not already signed up, please send me an email at blum, B-L-U-M, at lythampartners.com, or you can visit the website, lythampartners.com/virtual, click on the one-on-one meeting request button, and we'll look to get you taken care of. So with that, let's begin. Brian, again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Robert. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So, for those that may be unfamiliar with the company, let's sort of start off with a brief description and maybe a little bit of your background and how you came to the company.
Yeah, great. So by way of background, I've been a capital markets guy my whole life, big emphasis on mining finance, U.S. M&A firm, prop trader at a big Canadian bank, and ultimately an early partner at Windermere Capital, where we would look at investments in early stage mining stories. And that was really the evolution of how I became involved with Arianne. We'd come across Arianne, and it was a very interesting story, albeit early. And we were the first institutional investor, and that was quite some time ago. And as the company just kind of progressed and progressed, we were there for successive rounds as the company just advanced. In 2014, I did join the board of directors, and in 2016, I did join with the company as senior manager. As you said today, I'm president of the company.
So the main asset, talk a little bit about it, phosphate, right? And describe the importance of phosphate and maybe how we all come into contact with it in our daily lives.
Sure. Well, I think some of the listeners here might be surprised to hear just how important phosphate is in their daily lives. Of course, most people know it as fertilizer, and fertilizer equals food. And so whatever's on their table, probably had its origin as a result of phosphate. Beyond that, it's also used directly in foods. It's used in animal feeds. If you brush your teeth or that, you're using phosphate, and it is very pervasive. Additionally, there are growing specialty applications, which I'm sure we'll get into in the conversation, but it's now part of automotive with LFP batteries, etc. So phosphate plays a very, very important role in all of our lives.
So, before we get into the project a little bit more, set the stage for what the sort of the world supply of phosphate looks like, where does it come from, et cetera.
Sure. So, phosphate, first of all, is a mined mineral, and it is, again, necessary to human life. A lot of people ask me, well, is there a substitute to phosphate? And the substitute is starvation. So, interestingly, phosphate, look, it's one of the three macronutrients in fertilizer, nitrogen and potash being the other two. But really, the three are very separate, and they do have their own supply-demand dynamics. Now, when you're talking about phosphate, it's probably the one that has the most compelling supply-demand at this time. And really, it's because most of the world doesn't have it. So here in North America, we run a deficit. In Western Europe, in South America, large areas of Asia, we all run a deficit in it. And the interesting thing about phosphate is demand for it grows every single year. So in essence, a lot of the world is short, and that short is getting bigger. And so where do we get that from? Is most of it comes from the Middle East and North Africa. So Morocco today is by far the world's largest player. Look, Morocco is, I think, a good jurisdiction, but it's definitely in a neighborhood that from time to time we've seen unrest. Tunisia, for example, used to be the second largest producer of phosphate for the export market and Arab Spring, and today, they're no longer an export and from time to time an importer. So countries like Jordan, Algeria, Egypt, they're the ones who are making up that deficit. So, obviously, I think it's something that we need to realize and understand that from a security of supply perspective, phosphate is definitely one of those essential commodities, but one where the sources, we need to recognize that we're reliant on places far away to get what we need, even though the farm is here in Nebraska or Kansas or Saskatchewan. It's highly reliant on what's going on in the Middle East.
So the sort of supply chain or that whole process of phosphates, it's obviously coming out of a mine. It's being controlled by whom? Is it by end sort of producers of fertilizers, and what's sort of that makeup of kind of this global supply that's out there?
Yeah, good question. So to your point, actually 85% of the phosphate mines, the phosphate rock production is integrated. So yes, it's owned by the guys who make the downstream product, the fertilizer. Now, look, the logic behind it that doesn't vary from any other business. The more vertically integrated you can get, well, the more profit you get to keep. The challenge is that a lot of these guys and companies that have that excess phosphate concentrate, well, they're expanding their own fertilizer operation. So the logic goes something like this. Well, I have excess phosphate capacity. I can sell that phosphate concentrate to someone else, maybe an American producer, and he turns it into fertilizer and sells it to the farmer in North America. Maybe I should just expand my own operations and I'll sell directly to the farmer in North America. And we've seen that more and more. In fact, there's actually been some import duties placed on phosphate that comes from Morocco and Russia to try and protect against that. I'm not entirely certain what you're protecting against. You require the stuff, and there's not enough stuff in North America, but be that as it may. Now, what's interesting is that other 15%, that 15% that's not integrated. So that's getting harder and harder to come by. And as you might expect, it's getting more and more expensive. Phosphate prices, fertilizer prices, grain prices have all been moving considerably. And there's kind of that race for those guys who need it. Where are they going to source it? And I know we're going to get into Arianne in a little bit, but look, Arianne is extremely well placed to address that, because we are projected to be the next really large scale phosphate mine to come on stream. At this time, we remain independent, and that product is available to whomever might need it. But yes, it's definitely a tight market, and one that is really controlled by just a few players.
All right, so sort of setting the stage here, you've got 85% of the world's supply is sort of tied up with the integrated guys. The other 15% is in, I think 70% or thereabouts of that 15% is located in the Middle East and sort of North Africa, correct?
Yeah, I mean, not quite exactly. I'd say that most of the phosphate outright is in the Middle East and North Africa. They do convert a bunch of it to fertilizer themselves. Saudi Arabia, for example, does have a fair amount of phosphate concentrate, but they don't sell the phosphate concentrate. They'll only sell the finished product.
Right.
So look, they are definitely a big player, the Middle East and North Africa, both in finished product and the concentrate. But to your point, that 15% that that we require, that's traded to guys like Mosaic or Nutrient or Yara or Israel Chemical, the bulk of that comes out of the Middle East. They get that product and then they'll turn it into their finished product.
Right. And so it's sort of, it's creating this need, I guess, for we've talked about food supply, and you and I were on a panel here a couple of months ago talking about sort of worldwide food supply and some of the security issues that surround that. Let's kind of now dive into Arianne and what it is, where your project is located, the size and scope in comparison to some of the other ones that are out there. Let's begin there.
Great. Okay, so one thing that I did neglect to mention is when you're talking about phosphate, and this I think is also a very key point to understanding Arianne, and I'm not here to give a geology lecture, but most of the world's phosphate comes from a sedimentary deposit, roughly 90%. Now, I think the listeners need to understand that gold, for example, if you dig it out of the ground in Nevada, Argentina, Siberia, it's all the same. It all trades at the same price. Mm-hmm. That's not the case for phosphate. Again, as I just said, most of the world's phosphate comes from sedimentary deposits. And the challenge with those are they tend to have other deleterious elements in there, radioactive elements, heavy metals like cadmium. And of course, since you're ultimately talking about food, that's not wonderful. And we try and deal with it because, as I had said earlier, no phosphate, no food. Now, there are these rare deposits, igneous deposits. There's only maybe a dozen in the world, of which Arianne has one. And these things are, as I said, pretty rare, but they don't have the contaminants. They don't have the radioactive, and certainly in our case, we have no issues with radioactive elements or heavy metals. And this is key, obviously, from just a health safety point of view, an environmental safety point of view. And also, again, unlike gold, that'll trade at the same price because the gold's all the same, the phosphate is going to trade at different prices depending on the grade. And Arianne will be producing a very high purity phosphate that does get it premium pricing. So, that's the backdrop. So in terms of Arianne itself, it's situated in Canada, the province of Quebec. So in terms of security of supply or issues like that, or although we can address the global market, addressing that North American shortage, we're ideally placed. We're not particularly far north in the province. We're fortunate in that most of our necessary infrastructure is already in place. That's namely a hydroelectric dam, which is about 30 kilometers away. We've contracted for our life of mine supply. And of course, being hydroelectricity, you're talking about a clean, renewable source of energy. Being in the province of Quebec, it's well priced. The oversized haul roads are already there. They go down to a port. The only real piece of infrastructure that is not pre-existing that we would need to add on, I'd mentioned it heads down to a port. That port, currently, their loading facilities are just on the North Shore. We do need a loading facility on the South Shore, but the port has received its okays to do that. The project itself has been underway for quite some time. It's been able to advance. We've received our permits. We have strong social acceptability, collaboration agreement with the First Nations. But really, what is this project? I've already touched on the pureness of it. It does make the purest concentrate that one can get, but it's also the world's largest. So today, our feasibility study, bankable, had a 26-year life of mine at 3 million tons. Subsequently, we drilled that out. We're pushing 50 years. So today we are the world's single largest greenfield phosphate deposit. Again, it's the purest. It's here in Canada. I'd argue it's the safest. So you are really looking at something world class. A lot of people talk world class, but at the end of the day, when you're the biggest, the purest, and the safest, I feel comfortable using that term, world class as well. The fact that we're permitted, we're a shovel-ready project. As you know, certainly as the world is more concerned with regards to environmental, that path forward is much more difficult. And today I'm happy to say that we've got everything in place.
So let's talk about the size there just a little bit further. You mentioned a couple of numbers. Help put that in perspective as it relates to some of the current pricing out there in the marketplace for what you just described as sort of the high quality product that comes out there in the, on the pricing in that side of the market.
Yeah, that's a super question. So one thing that I'll say as a backdrop is agricultural commodities, fertilizers, they tend to run pretty long cycles. In the case of phosphate fertilizer, last cycle topped around 2012 and only bottomed the end of 2019. So you're looking at 7 years. This cycle really kind of started summer of 2020. So you're about 18 months into it. And, certainly it's been a pretty good move, but unlike a lot of other commodities or equities or real estate, yet to go to all-time highs, still a ways from all-time highs. And, personally, I think when you're talking about something important as food or inputs for food, I think we are going much higher. But today, as it stands, the price of phosphate fertilizer, so a benchmark kind of Moroccan, is trading at about $180 a ton. To your point, we do make a high purity. So ours today is trading at roughly $235 a ton. So within the context of what does that mean for Arianne in production, we will be producing roughly 3 million tons of concentrate a year, which would generate, again, at today's prices, roughly $700 million a year. And we are projected to be an extremely low cost provider of this stuff, low cash cost. And so again, today in production, we would probably be generating somewhere around $450 million a year gross profit. Now, I know a lot of your listeners, they sit there and say, well, yeah, it's very cyclical. It's great to talk now and how robust you're going to be. Where were you in the bad times? And so, again, because of where we are on the cost curve, even if you were to go back kind of December of 2019, as we hit those lows, we'd still have been quite profitable, probably to the tune of $125, $150 million a year gross profit. So yes, we've had a nice run. I do suspect it's going higher. Again, we're not at our highs, and we are extremely leveraged. Every $10 move in the price of phosphate should mean roughly $30 million a year, right down to our bottom line.
So help us understand what some of the next steps are then, right, in terms of getting this into production and hitting some of those numbers that we're talking about?
Right. So look, Arianne's a very advanced project, as I've touched on. It's kind of unique in the fact that, again, we've had a 7-year downtrend, and they always say the cure to a low commodity price is a low commodity price. And so for 7 years, you had the price moving down, and when the price moves down, no one really worries about supply. No one expands their supply. The guys who are developing projects usually, unfortunately, really kind of roll over, and you know that's what we've seen. Arianne was really the only major development story to continue to advance during this period of time. So again, we are fully permitted. We've done our work. We've hit our milestones. The banks have reviewed us. Most mines, of course, get built on a considerable amount of debt. And as you might imagine, if you're going to be profiting $450 million a year, your capacity to take on a considerable amount of debt is there. And the banks have already strongly indicated their interest. So what we need to do now to unlock that bank financing is to get offtakes. So unlike commodities, again, like say oil or copper, if you're building a project, they have exchange traded commodities. You can forward sell and you know address your production and your revenue. Phosphate, like many other commodities, is a contract market whereby you contract with a buyer and they commit to take X amount of tonnage. It's an offtake. And so that's where we are. The banks have said, provide us offtakes. We love the project. Just show us that you've got customers, and that's what it takes. So our job now is to bring those offtakes home. So we have signed a few to date. We still need a couple more to kind of get us through that threshold. 2021 has just been a remarkably busy year. Again, for 7 years, no one worried about supply. Demand grows every single year. 7 years later, oops. And so we are an answer to that oops. So yes, we get those offtakes. We go back to the banks. That unleashes our debt. We put together our final construction financing, and at that point, we stick a shovel in the ground, and out the other end comes phosphate concentrate, which we sell to those customers.
Now, I want to get into some of the demand dynamics here in just a moment, but I think what sort of leads into that, and you mentioned LFP batteries, you also, I believe, mentioned Russia and some of the things that both they and China have recently done to put some sort of limits on the export of phosphate, right, and use of fertilizer and sort of protecting it. You know, how is that sort of impacting what it is you're trying to accomplish with offtake agreements, for instance?
Sure. So I often joke there's a story in mythology about Cassandra, and Cassandra was given the gift of being able to see into the future, but the curse of no one listening to her. And when you look at phosphate, the reality is this is a needed commodity that comes from parts of the world that can be challenging, and we are not self-sufficient. And some of these ingredients now are at play. So to your point, China. So where the Middle East is the big player in the phosphate concentrate, China is a big player in the finished phosphate fertilizer. In fact, they account for about 30% of the market. So think about that. Saudi Arabia is maybe 12 to 14% of the oil market. You come in one day, the Saudi shipping oil, the world would convulse. It would just be chaos. Mm-hmm. So about 2 months ago, China actually announced that they're halting all exports of phosphate fertilizer. And so although most people don't watch closely the phosphate market, you can imagine the upheaval. And so they are not shipping. India today is the world's largest importer of phosphate. Half of that came from China. There's a country of 1.3 billion people that are not going to get their phosphate fertilizer. Why did they do that? There's a lot of questions, more supply internally to try and keep the prices down. Their demand is strong. There's also some talk that they require that excess phosphate for LFP, lithium iron phosphate batteries, which I think we'll get into in a moment. Russia as well, as you said, they put on export quotas as well. So the world really needs to wake up to this. The reality is that those who have the phosphate are going to make sure that their farmers are well taken care of. Those who do not have phosphate, well, there's a problem. And so back here to North America, yes, we have phosphate, Mosaic, Nutrient, they do produce, but their mines are depleting, and we are more and more reliant on imports, which look like they are less and less going to be coming. And so that is definitely a challenge.
Right. So in the few minutes that we have remaining here, again, another, I think, dynamic that's impacted this market has been the LFP battery. So, help everyone understand what's going on in this market, how phosphate sort of fits into it, and how it may impact, again, perhaps even some of the offtakes that you're discussing here.
Great, yeah. So LFP is a lithium iron phosphate battery. It's one of several chemistries that are out there for use in the electric vehicles. They've been around for a while, but never really got much attention. And then because of technological advancements, et cetera, they've now kind of presented themselves as probably the battery chemistry, certainly for standard range vehicles. I guess the big highlight there is a couple of months ago, Tesla had announced that all of their standard range vehicles in the world are going to use LFPs. Volkswagen has made similar comments. Ford has said that they're going LFP. And look, the advantage is you're not using things like cobalt or nickel that are much more expensive and harder to source. That said, as you might imagine, we talked earlier, different grades of phosphate, and you do need a very high purity phosphate, phosphoric acid, for these batteries. And if you want a good high purity phosphoric acid, you should probably start with a good high purity phosphate concentrate, which is what Arianne has. We've been doing a lot of work with some of these battery companies and automotive companies. And about 5 weeks ago, we did announce that we were heading towards the final stages of meeting specs for battery companies to show that our phosphate works. So certainly as the world moves towards decarbonization, more electric vehicles, the LFP, that is an added demand on phosphate, certainly high purity phosphate like ours. And yeah, it's just going to be another driver. So you've got the supply not having built up. You've got people kind of putting up barriers to that supply, and now you've got expanded uses for phosphate, and this is getting pretty tight. And again, Arianne's well suited because, look, we have a high purity phosphate that's going to work in fertilizer or specialty applications like batteries, and that's great because, back to your point, we need offtakes. And whether that offtake is from a fertilizer company or a battery company or some of these other applications, the banks want me to get my offtakes. The more potential customers I have across varying industries, the better that is. And look, batteries are technology. Cars today are technology on wheels, and these guys move pretty quickly. and certainly as a would-be supplier to an industry that's moving quickly, I'm excited. I'm excited.
Right.
And that really should help us get the offtakes that we require.
Well, I think that you probably are hitting on it. I know we've only got a minute or so left here. You know, as investors look at 2022, we're calling this our 2022 vision event. I think you've sort of laid out what the key milestones are, right? Is offtakes. But you know, if we were to sit here in 12 months, you know, what are some of the biggest risks to achieving those goals?
Yeah. Well, look, like every business, it's about execution. We know what we need to do, and that's get those offtakes. But I'd also say in terms of risk, look, you know, this is geology. This deposit formed hundreds of millions of years ago. It's not a beta versus VHS that the first one out is going to win. That deposit is there. It's not going anywhere. So, you know, maybe the risk is time. We will need phosphate. It is there. And so instead of it taking 2 or 3 quarters to get the offtakes I need, maybe it takes 4 or 5. I mean, certainly I'd be disappointed, but in the grand scheme of things, you know, I'd say that's your risk. The company is well funded at this point and doesn't need money to continue its operations. And so look, we're permitted. I'd say that most of the risk is out of it, and I'd really center it on time. You know, the flip side, of course, is you know, today we have $100 million Canadian market cap, call it whatever, $80 million US for a project that is, you know, fully baked, shovel ready, permitted, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I think that's pretty cheap for a project that today in production is gross profiting $450 million. And so if we are successful in 2022 and get those offtakes and get that shovel in the ground and get going, traditionally single asset development companies, when they announce that their construction finance is in place, they usually trade to 1 times first year's projected EBITDA. So I think it's a pretty sizable upside from here. I do think that people are waking up to the ag sector, investors, money managers. Ag's a great place because ag is a non-correlated investment. It doesn't move around just the way the S&P moves. And everyone's talking about inflation, and I see it, and I'm sure you see it when you go to the supermarket. And if you're trying to figure out how do you protect against inflation, there are a lot of derivative ways. You can go and buy precious metals or crypto. But at the end of the day, what's going to inflate? My food bill. So go make an investment in something that is going to benefit directly from that. And so I'm very excited about 2022. I think the macro is good. I think we've got a great project. I think people are starting to wake up to that. And look, I'm really excited about what I think the future holds for us.
Fantastic. Well, look, let's leave it on that note. Brian, thank you very much for the time today. Greatly appreciated as always. Again, I want to remind all the participants out there, if you have not already signed up for a one-on-one meeting this week with Brian, send me an email, Blum, BLUM at lythampartners.com, or again, visit the website and you can make a request that way as well. We hope you all enjoyed the conference. Brian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.